Barely Research Facts is a fact-based podcast brought to you by ArtNowThus, an experiential arts agency based out of Mumbai. Each week, we pick a word at random, dive into it, and see what it brings to us. We are your hosts. My name is Ragini, and this is Shar. Let's go. Hi, and welcome to our last episode for this year. Our last long episode for this year. We've been doing this for 1 full year now, guys. It's a pretty big deal.
Wow. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And keeping in mind with absolutely no context on why, end of year or last episode of the year or whatever, our word for this episode is speed. So, I don't know why. We didn't realize at the time that this was... I didn't think we realized we were celebrating an anniversary. Well, we're not really celebrating an anniversary just yet, but we're coming pretty close to it. And that is...
Maybe it's because we're speeding towards our anniversary.
Oh, well done. Yes, that is why we've chosen this word.
There we go.
Yes. Thank you, Shar. Okay, so I'm going to jump in. Keeping that vein going, I'm going to jump into starting this episode off by talking about speed limits.
Okay.
Ominous.
So bringing everything to a halt.
Okay, the reason why this was particularly fascinating to me is because apparently, while mass-produced cars were clearly a product of the 20th century, but apparently speeding regulations have been in place since way before that. And the first cited speeding regulation dates back to 1652 in New Amsterdam.
Wow. Geez, what? Speeding on what?
Wagons and carts.
Okay.
So wagons and carts in 1652 could not be ridden or driven at a gallop. The punishment for doing so was a fine of £2, 2 Flemish pounds at the time, which would amount to about $150 today. So they were pretty serious about it.
Jeez.
Yeah. And then in the UK, in 1832, the Stage Carriage Act made it an offence to endanger a passenger's safety by furious driving, and a series of locomotive acts were thereafter introduced, which created even more speeding regulations. The most restrictive of these was an 1865 Act, which required all road locomotives, including automobiles, to travel at a maximum of 4 miles per hour in the country and 2 miles per hour in the city. Eventually in 1896, so they did raise the speed limit to 14 miles per hour. Jesus, what a racy time.
I know. Jeez.
In the US, there were early efforts to impose speed regulations for motor vehicles began in 1901 in Connecticut, where a bill was passed to sort of set the legal speed at 12 miles per hour in cities and 15 miles per hour on country roads. And then speeding laws sort of began to pop up around the United States in a few places. But as late as 1930, 12 states did not have any speed limits. And 28 states didn't even require you to have a driving license. So,
wow, rebels.
Really a great time, yeah. Great time to be a pedestrian. Good time to be a driver, though.
Considering there were more pedestrians than drivers.
Yeah, that's for the majority. So, but, across the US, sort of the adoption of speed regulations or any kind of traffic laws clearly was gradual and inconsistent across different states. And then even in the UK, you sort of see a similar pattern. Now, most of the history around speeding regulations seems to be in the US and the UK. And I think that's because, I guess other countries just adopted what they were doing or just took longer to have any kind of motorized vehicles.
Or it was forced upon them.
Yeah. And in the UK, for the most part, speed regulations were widely ignored. So very much, this could be like India right now. And they were actually even abolished in the 1930s. And eventually, though, a new act would be introduced in 1934 that set the speed limit at 30 miles per hour in areas that were built up. But there were no speed limits that really existed on motorways until 1965, when a national speed limit of 70 miles per hour was imposed. And then rising fuel prices in the 1970s resulted in many US states sort of adopting speed limits in an effort to save money and resources. And in 1974, President Nixon agreed to a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour for all states. And it actually did have a beneficial effect on traffic fatality, which dropped from 4.23 per million miles in 1972 to 2.73 in 1983. So, clear benefit. But as, by the 1980s, when the oil crisis ended and the cost of fuel sort of became more
affordable.
Effective, yeah. The national speed limit was increased to 65 miles per hour. And however, not everyone was happy with this new national limit that was imposed. Like, people wanted to have their own, it kind of became this whole raging debate around like freedom versus regulation. So Montana and Nevada apparently to date have been opposed to speed limits of any kind. And in 1995, the maximum national speed limit was abolished and sort of control of speeding limit was given to each state. And then many would kind of raise their speed limits to 70 miles per hour or higher. But it's still a raging debate. Now, just to kind of wrap this up with some really interesting little facts that I found about speeding limits. The first person to ever be convicted of a speeding, to be given a speeding ticket for that matter, was a gentleman called Walter Arnold of England. He was fined on January 28th, 1896, because he was caught driving at a whopping 8 miles per hour. And he was fined 1 shilling. This was, I'm assuming, just before the speed limit was officially raised. And then the Autobahn highway in Germany has no speed limit. And apparently, also unsurprisingly, rural roads on the Isle of Man and Indian states of Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Telangana also tend to lack speed laws. Switzerland, however, does not have fixed fines for speeding. Instead, fines are calculated based on the vehicle's speed and the driver's income. So, a 37-year-old wealthy man was pulled over for going at 186 miles per hour on the highway, where the speed limit was 74.5 miles per hour. He had to pay close to $1 million as his fine, which is possibly the most expensive speeding ticket ever. So, probably don't want to mess with the Swiss when it comes to speeding. But apparently, Paris has recently imposed a speed limit across the city, and you cannot go above. They've actually dropped it to below 20 miles per hour. I think it's about 19 miles per hour is the set speed limit in the city, which would translate to about 30 kilometers per hour. So you can't just drive down and zip through any roads in Paris any longer. You have to go at this sort of speed of 19 miles per hour. And needless to say,
that is really slow.
It is really slow. And so I think but they're basically doing it as an effort to kind of reduce, make the city more pedestrian friendly, to reduce the effects of climate change, and just sort of encourage more people to like cycle around or take public transport. But obviously, like, it's led to, there's a fair amount of uproar because people are just like, then why drive at all? Why don't I just walk? Why am I driving?
Can you get to 20 miles an hour on a bicycle? Probably not.
According to some of these people fighting in Paris, I think they think that they can.
Okay. I think that's like for us Indians who grew up with metrics, that's 34 kilometers an hour, which I don't know. Maybe you could on a downhill on a good day when you've eaten your breakfast. Maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the time it's fine. You could possibly think of taking a cab. Yeah, so that's what's on in the world of current affairs when it comes to speed limits today.
Okay, let's go back to the 1800s.
Okay.
So I have a huge girl crush.
Okay.
Now, Dorothy Levitt is this lady I came across in my research for this word. She was an early motorist and she competed in speed trials and long distance races. She is phenomenal. She's set records and then broken them herself. One of the records she set was the ladies' world speed record in the Brighton Speed Trials of 1905. And then she went on to, in 1906, break the women's world speed record at Blackpool. And she did this by recording a speed of 90.88 miles per hour over 1 kilometer. So she went really fast over 1 kilometer.
Over 1 kilometer, sweet.
Yeah, and she was driving this car that was by a brand called Napier. And the story with Dorothy Levitt and Napier is that she was working as a secretary for Napier & Son. They were a luxury car maker. And she was a secretary. She was doing her job, going about her business, and then enter Selwyn Edge, who has an interesting name, but also was a racing driver and a businessman. He spotted her and was taken by her and thought she was super attractive. And he thought that, okay, this is a good opportunity for marketing and publicity. So I'm going to teach you how to drive cars, and I'm going to make you enter these speed competitions. And it worked out really well for the both of them because she was an instant hit, not only because she was attractive and good for marketing, etc., but also because she was really good full stop at motoring. So she won many competitions, she won many trials in different classes of cars, and she obviously only drove Napier cars. She also went on to compete successfully in races and trials all over Europe, which was a huge thing at the time. Now, this is obviously, you think about the time. This is the late 19th century, early 20th. In the early days of motoring, cars were considered they were male territory. Like even today, people are fighting against stereotypes where women don't know anything about cars. So at the time, hugely male dominated area. And she was this petite woman who had a penchant for wearing frills and froth and always drove in an ankle length tea coat with a hat and veil and did it well, like won all these medals and championships and trials. And she was also a spinster, which with all the people who've heard our previous episode on charkha and chick flicks, you'll know what this means. And you'll know that I'm not using it offensively. I'm only using it as a way to reference a previous episode. But yeah, so she didn't marry. She stayed in an apartment with 3 other women. And so she rejected all these ideals of the Victorian woman and did really cool stuff, basically. So she was also a champion of female motorists because she paved the way for a lot of other women who wanted to not only just drive, full stop, but also just, compete in trials and things like that. So she wrote a regular column for a newspaper called The Graphic, and she just, extolled in the amazingness of driving and encouraged women to take up driving. And then she wrote a book, and I have read the book and I love it.
You read the book?
Yeah. It's called The Woman in the Car, a chatty little handbook for women who motor or want to motor. And
wow.
It's really interesting to see because you don't often think about books that were published at the time and how savvy people were even then, because the book is accompanied, it's broken down into appetizing chapters, some of which include the car, its cost, upkeep, and accessories, the mechanism of a car, troubles, how to avoid and how to mend them. And also, she talks about what to wear, which I will go into a little bit of detail.
Yes.
So this book, it's on, by the way, it's a free book because it's past its licensing. So it's on gutenberg.org, where you'll find other books as well. But this one in particular is on there. The book is a mixture of these chapters of written recommendations and tips, but they're accompanied by very topical photographs. So she did a photo shoot to accompany this book, and the pictures are all her posed in front of a car doing a particular activity, like fixing a brake or, and this is a Victorian car, so bear in mind it looks nothing like what we do these days. But yeah, Dorothy's all up in there with her hat and tea coat. Now, if you want to hear a little bit about what she calls the all-important question of dress. So she talks.
Yes, I do.
You do, don't you? You just do. So she says that automobilists are nowadays more careful in the choice of their attire, but there are still a goodly number who seem to imagine it is impossible to look anything but hideous when in an automobile. She says, when racing or when in countries where speed is not looked upon with such horror as in England, on the long, straight, seemingly never-ending military roads of France, one can travel at a speed that makes goggles or masks a necessity. But for motoring under ordinary conditions, there's no reason why one should wear them. She also says, if you're going to drive alone in the highways and byways, it might be advisable to carry a small revolver, casually in the middle of this section.
Yeah.
I have an automatic Colt and find it very easy to handle as there is practically no recoil, a great consideration to a woman.
Wow.
And then
how often does she use this to
Well, she apparently the reason that she was called the fastest woman on earth is because she drove to Liverpool and back from London in 2 days with nothing for company but her Colt and her dog.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
what a great life, dude.
She's got good advice.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I think that made her an even more interesting character to me was she mentions the mirror should be fairly large to be really useful, the one that you carry in a car, and it is better to have one with a handle to it. Sometimes you will wonder if you hear a car behind you, and while the necessity or inclination to look around is rare, you can, with the mirror, see in a flash what is in the rear without losing your forward way and without releasing your right-hand grip of the steering wheel. So she was an early innovator of the rear view mirror because this is 7 years before the mirror, the rear view mirror was.
Okay, so I was just going to say, okay, so she's basically talking about a rear view mirror and she's explaining it because, women didn't drive.
Yeah.
But no, she's inventing it.
Yeah. Well, it's just she's just a really interesting person. And I advise anybody to go and just read up more about her and go read her book. Like, I know she's not going to
Yeah,
get royalties.
I've got the book. I've got the book open in front of me right now. It's great. The pictures are great, and she's gorgeous.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah. Oh
So
wow,
that's
that's a
the
fun.
story of Dorothy Levitt.
Yeah, it's a fun one. I was not expecting. I thought it'd be like just a story about a woman who ran a lot, but this is great.
And as advice, I want to end the segment with a one-liner from Dorothy Levitt as advice to everyone everywhere, not just women. She says, "Be sure you are right, then go ahead."
Okay, so I'm going to move back in time a fair bit from Dorothy Levitt also. But I'm going to go to this study I found, and it's a really interesting study, which talks about how prehistoric man would have basically kicked our ass in everything. It's basically a study that there is an anthropologist in Australia who discovered that ancient aboriginals would have outrun Usain Bolt easily, and the Neanderthal woman would have crushed Arnold Schwarzenegger in an arm wrestling competition. So this is a gentleman by the name of Peter McAllister, who is the author of a really interesting book called Manthropology, the Science of the Inadequate Modern Man. Who claims that men today are the weakest in history and would have been trumped in feats of strength or speed by our ancient ancestors. Now, he's just generally horrible to men in his entire book, like just the way the book is written. I will not read, but you can go and check it out some other time when you have the time. Basically, Mr. McAllister found evidence that proved that the modern man is inferior to his predecessors in, amongst other fields, basic Olympic athletic disciplines of running and jumping. So, in his conclusions, the speed of Australian Aboriginals 20,000 years ago are based on a set of footprints which were preserved in a fossilized claypan lake bed of 6 men chasing prey. So it's amazing because basically these random footprints have survived and they've given us a sense of how fast these men were running.
Wow.
And an analysis of the footsteps would show that one of the men, dubbed T8, I don't know why, but he's dubbed T8, reached speeds of 37 kilometers per hour on a soft, muddy lake edge. So now, in comparison, in 2009, Bolt had reached a top speed of 42 kilometers per hour during his then world 100 meters record of 9.69 seconds in the Beijing Olympics. But however, if you can add modern training, spike shoes, rubberized tracks, all of the things that Usain Bolt has to kind of achieve these high speeds, it's very likely that these Aboriginal hunters would have reached speeds of 45 kilometers per hour. So already surpassing him. And this is also to just say that they're running close to the maximum if they're chasing an animal, right? So that's what the hypothesis is. And so they can do 37 kilometers on really soft ground. They could have totally outdone him. Now, this is also saying that these are 6 random men because we don't know whose footprints were fossilized. They could have been like, you don't know who the fastest guy in Australia was back in like 20,000 years ago. And he could have been like way above 45 kilometers per hour. Also, now when you talk about the high jump, apparently just to like conclude, like move into everything else that this book talks about, in ancient times, it was an initiation ritual for any man to attain manhood to jump to the height of his height. So he had to basically jump. So there are photographs taken by German anthropologists that show young men jumping to heights of 2.52 meters early last century.
Jeez.
And so they developed these amazing abilities to kind of like, they were jumping from boyhood to just prove themselves. And it was just what they did. And a Neanderthal woman had 10% more muscle bulk than the modern European man. Trained to capacity, she would have reached 90% of Schwarzenegger's bulk at his peak in the 1970s. However, because of a quirk in her physiology, she would have a much shorter lower arm, and therefore he believes that the Neanderthal woman would have been able to slam him into the table without a problem. So basically,
Fabulous.
he's like, yeah. And so he's just like,
this reminded me, the jumping reminded me of a story that my family told me when they, on their visit to Africa, they had gone to see the Masai Mara tribe. And amongst the people who had gone was my cousin Kara, who's, 14 or something at the time. And there was a cute incident where some of the tribesmen were offered my uncle a whole herd of goats for my cousin. And they wanted to determine who would win Kara, my cousin, by jumping really high up. And I'm assuming this is like the origin of that in some way.
Yeah, I guess like the most able man.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like the African swimmer.
Suffice to say, Kara came back home.
Okay.
Nobody could jump high enough.
She was not married up.
No, she wasn't.
Yeah, so, I mean, you could trust that, according to Mr. McAllister, by the modern man is a pathetic symbol of manhood, according to him. Yeah, and he basically says that we pretty much lost most of our physical abilities because of how much time we spend doing nothing, sitting in front of computers and working.
Fair play.
Yeah, good point. So I have to say that maybe I don't think early man would have known how to use AirPods, but he would have definitely outrun us.
So, okay. So, tell me if any of these names are familiar to you, Ragini.
Okay.
Paul Tergat, David Rudisha, Joyceline Jepskowski, Jeffrey Kamworor, Bridget Koske, and Kipchoge
Am I supposed
Keno.
to be just feeling really uninformed at this point?
Well, I was too until I read about this.
Yay!
Yeah. And if any of the listeners are familiar with them, they're all East African runners and really highly acclaimed runners. Now, and they're all, a majority of them are from the Rift Valley region. And it's an interesting peculiarity that since bursting on the scene at the 1968 Mexico City Summer Olympics, Kenyan and Ethiopian distance runners have dominated by far. Like, for instance, since 1991, the men's winner at the Boston Marathon has either been a Kenyan or Ethiopian 26 of the 29 times.
Oh, really? Wow.
East African women have won the laurel wreath 21 times in the last 24 years at Boston. And funnily enough, a popular annual marathon in Lagos in Nigeria, the Axis Bank Marathon, has never been won by a Nigerian.
So who's it won by?
By mostly East Africans, Kenyans, Ethiopians.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah. So, this isn't news to people. I'm sure people are generally aware. I'm sure even us too, who didn't know many of the names on that list. Yeah. We did know that Kenyan runners are the elite.
Yeah.
So people have obviously done a lot of research into why that is, why that people from such a small geographical location in comparison to the rest of the world do particularly well at this one thing. So most Kenyan elite runners hail from the same ethnic groups known as the Kalenjins or the Nandis, and the groups make up just 10% of the nation's population of 50 million. So we're talking an even smaller number within that number that makes up this true elite. So some other reasons that people have jotted down that, explain some of this. The first is that their body mass index. So they have a body mass index like as teenagers of like 15.5, which is like the only way to really qualify it is a skinny AF. And it's seen as a point of pride to be skinny, to be muscular, to be, just really light. So that obviously contributes when you're hauling yourself across, a marathon. That makes a huge difference. There's also some research that has gone into what they have been calling the barefoot debate. So there's a researcher and evolutionary biologist called Daniel E. Lieberman, who caused an international stir when he published a paper showing that running in cushioned sneakers encourages athletes to strike the ground harder than when running barefoot. And Kenyans and Ethiopians often run miles to school barefoot, which gives them a special edge. So they're already...
Oh, so they're already lighter on their feet.
Yeah, they're already ahead of the curve, no matter what. The next thing is diet. So they apparently have a really carbohydrate-rich diet, and they consume the same amount of protein as really high-level athletes do, just in their normal diet. So generally, the staple diets of Kenyan runners includes ugali, which is like a stiff porridge made from maize or millet, green leafy vegetables, milk, kidney beans, and eggs. So, they're already eating the food of athletes. Another thing is how they think and what causes them to be more psychologically stronger than most other people is the way of life that they have there. Which, for some people, it'll be